The dark legend of Wyatt Earp, one of the most celebrated lawmen in American history. The story of Wyatt Earp has captivated imaginations for over a century. He's inspired countless movies, songs, and those touristy reenactments you see everywhere. But here's the question that haunts us: who was the man lurking behind the myth? Was he truly as heroic as the legends would have us believe? Sure, we've all heard tales of his legendary deeds, but there was something darker, something chilling about this so-called heroic figure. Let me take you into the violent, turbulent history of Wyatt Earp, Tombstone's infamous marshal. A life in motion. From the moment he drew his first breath, Earp was destined to wander. Shortly after his birth, his father Nicholas packed up the entire family and joined a westward caravan heading to California. The promise was simple: vast stretches of fertile farmland and a chance at redemption, a fresh start for the Earp clan. When the Civil War erupted, the Earps were settled in Pella, and 3 of Wyatt's brothers immediately enlisted in the Union Army. Young Wyatt, desperate to follow in their footsteps, was only 13 years old. But that didn't stop him from trying. Time and again, he ran away from home, attempting to enlist. And time and again, his cantankerous father tracked him down and dragged him back home by the scruff of his neck. The life that almost was. Wyatt Earp nearly lived an entirely different life, one that would have changed the course of Wild West history forever. By the time he reached 21, his family had relocated to Lamar, Missouri. There, while scraping out an existence, he encountered a beautiful young woman named Urilla Sutherland. The connection was instantaneous, electric. Within a year of their first meeting, they were married. Earp purchased a modest plot of land, built a house with his own hands for his new bride, and soon she was pregnant with their first child. This young family appeared to be settling into a quiet, uneventful domestic life. But as you already know, that's not how Wyatt Earp's story unfolds. Just as Urilla was about to give birth, tragedy struck with devastating force. She contracted the deadly typhoid fever and died within mere days. In one crushing moment, everything Earp loved was ripped away from him. That day changed him forever. After losing her, he became cold, calculating, ruthless. Had his wife lived, the entire tapestry of Wild West history would have been woven differently. But apparently, fate had other plans for Wyatt Earp. Falling into darkness. As the young, grieving Earp grew older, he fell in with a dangerous crowd, roughnecks and criminals. By his mid-20s, he found himself on the wrong side of the law more often than not. Eventually, justice caught up with him. Earp was charged with horse theft, a serious crime in those days. A U.S. Marshal apprehended him and threw him in jail to await trial. But Earp wasn't the type to sit around waiting for his fate to be decided by others. Just before his sentencing, he escaped from his cell and fled to Peoria, Illinois. His troubles, however, were far from over. In Peoria, Earp quickly became infamous, for all the wrong reasons. The townsfolk considered him bad news, dubbing him the Peoria Bummer. The law-abiding citizens of that respectable village grew to despise him, viewing him as the figurehead of a certain class of sleazy loafer who brought embarrassment to their town. Little did they know that this no-good bum would eventually become one of the most famous lawmen in Wild West history. Clearly, Earp wasn't winning any awards in Peoria. So when word reached him that his brother James was running a house of ill repute in Wichita, he saddled up and headed for Kansas, toot sweet. First taste of authority. Wichita was a crucial railroad terminal at the time, a key stop for rangers driving their cattle up from Texas. The lawmen in town desperately needed all the help they could get. And this is where Earp got his first taste of real authority. After helping an off-duty police officer track down a group of wagon thieves, Earp joined the marshal's office soon after. Suddenly, he had a respectable position and a steady paycheck. But life as a lawman was anything but simple. Earp had inherited his father's wild temper, and it eventually cost him his job in Wichita. So Earp did what he did best. He left town and went to join his brother James, who had set up yet another dingy boarding house, this time in Dodge City. Wyatt met up with him there and started all over again. The birth of a legend. Later in 1876, an outlaw by the name of Dirty Dave Rudabaugh stole from the Santa Fe Railroad Company and fled south toward Texas. This proved to be a pivotal moment in Earp's life for 2 crucial reasons. First, the Dodge City Marshal's office made Earp a temporary deputy U.S. Marshal and sent him off to track down Dirty Dave. Second, while hunting the outlaw, Earp crossed paths with a notorious gambler who had played cards with Rudabaugh. That gambler's name was Doc Holliday, and their conversation marked the beginning of Earp's most important and enduring friendship. When Wyatt Earp first arrived in Dodge City, it was the very epitome of a wild, lawless frontier town. But things could change rapidly back then. Within just a few years, the town had begun to settle down considerably. And suddenly, shoot first ask questions later marshals like Earp found themselves extremely out of place. It was right around that time he received a letter from his brother Virgil, who had recently established himself in a booming new town over in Arizona territory. That was all the encouragement Earp needed. In 1879, he packed his belongings and set off for the most infamous chapter of his life, in the brand new mining town of Tombstone. Tombstone Rising. Shortly after arriving in Tombstone, his brother Virgil, still serving as a U.S. Marshal, hired him to help track down a gang of cowboys who had brazenly stolen 6 mules from the army. The gang responsible was known as the Cochise County Cowboys. The head of the gang, a man named Frank Patterson, agreed to bring the mules back to town the following day. But in reality, he had something very different in mind. The next day, the cowboys showed up in town completely empty-handed, simply so they could laugh directly in the faces of Virgil and Wyatt Earp. They didn't know it at the time, but they had just made a fatal mistake. A marshal's death. Not long after the mule fiasco, a group of cowboys caused trouble once again. In the dead of night, 5 members of the gang, led by the infamous Curly Bill Brocious, stumbled out of a saloon and started firing their revolvers at the moon. The town marshal, Fred White, emerged to try and disarm the drunken men. It was the last thing he ever did. White grabbed the barrel of Brocious's revolver, but it discharged, striking him in the groin. That's when Wyatt Earp, who had heard the shooting and come running, arrived on the scene. Earp took a more direct approach when it came to apprehending Brocious. He simply smashed the man over the head with the butt of his pistol. Fred White succumbed to his wounds not long after. However, in a strange twist, White and Brocious had been somewhat friendly, and in his final moments, White insisted that Brocious was innocent and shouldn't be held accountable. But whatever White said, the people of Tombstone loved their marshal, and they were out for blood. Curly Bill Brocious was one of the worst of the Cochise County Cowboys. But strangely enough, he had Wyatt Earp to thank for his life, for a time, at least. As he sat in a Tombstone jail cell, the townfolk cried for revenge, and he undoubtedly would have been lynched had he remained there. But thanks to White's call for mercy, Earp quickly had Brocious spirited away to nearby Tucson. Political tensions. Earp eventually rose to the rank of deputy sheriff in Tombstone, but it didn't last long. Wyatt Earp was many things, but a politician wasn't one of them. He ended up getting squeezed out for a man named Johnny Bean. Earp and Bean had already crossed paths in Tombstone and held no fond feelings for each other. But once Bean took over as sheriff, their bad blood intensified dramatically. Tensions in Tombstone were reaching a fever pitch. They came to a head one night in 1881. Around midnight, Doc Holliday and Ike Clanton got into a heated argument in one of Tombstone's many saloons. Holliday called Ike a dirty liar. Ike took exception to that. Virgil was finally fed up with the antics. He ambushed Clanton and bashed him over the head with his pistol, the trademark Earp move. He confiscated Clanton's revolver and hauled him down to the courthouse for a $25 fine. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but there was far more at play here than money. The Earps had crossed one of the most important Cochise County cowboys, and the notorious gang wasn't about to let that insult slide. The showdown. While Ike was inside the courthouse receiving his fine, right out front, Wyatt Earp nearly walked straight into Tom McLaury, one of the other Cochise County cowboys. The two men ended up nose to nose, and Earp asked the cowboy if he was armed. McLaury sneered that he was not, but Earp could clearly see a revolver tucked in the man's waistband. Earp suddenly drew his own sidearm and, as he was wont to do, struck McLaury over the head with it. Shortly after, 3 more cowboys arrived: Ike's brother Billy, Tom's brother Frank, and Billy Claiborne. Having 5 angry cowboys wandering the streets, at least 3 of whom were armed and dangerous, made Virgil Earp nervous. He decided to take it upon himself to disarm them by force. He called upon his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, as well as Doc Holliday, and headed across the streets of Tombstone toward the fated Corral. As the Earps strode across Tombstone, they encountered a frantic sheriff, Johnny Bean. According to Wyatt, Bean claimed that he had already disarmed the cowboys, which was a complete lie. Still, the Earps decided they would go and check for themselves. The Earps finally confronted the cowboys near the Corral, and it wasn't long before the shooting erupted. Nobody really knows who fired first, but most witnesses generally agreed that the first 2 shots happened almost simultaneously. Clearly, both sides were itching for a fight. When the gunsmoke finally cleared, Doc Holliday had a horrible bruise from a bullet that grazed his holster. Virgil Earp had been hit in the calf, and Morgan Earp had wounds in each of his shoulders. Only Wyatt remained unscathed, But while the Earps were injured, the cowboys fared far, far worse. Tom McLaury, Frank McLaury, and Billy Clanton all lay dead in the dust. As the wounded Earps stumbled away from the empty lot, they came across Johnny Behan once again. The flustered sheriff shouted, "I will have to arrest you." Wyatt Earp slowed for a moment, turned, looked him dead in the eye, and simply stated, "You have deceived me. You told me these men were disarmed. I went to disarm them." That's the kind of mic drop moment legends are made of. The aftermath. Ike Clanton did everything in his power to have the Earps and Holliday thrown in jail. In his defense, they did kill 3 men. The judge took sworn statements from over 30 witnesses. One of them was Wyatt's mortal enemy, Sheriff Behan, who, the weasel that he was, claimed that the cowboys had been completely innocent. He testified that they had all thrown up their arms and turned out their coats to show they were unarmed, but that the vicious Earps had opened fire anyway. It was a complete fabrication. But luckily for the Earps, there were plenty of other witnesses who had been poking their heads through windows to see what actually happened that day. The judge eventually ruled that there wasn't sufficient evidence to indict the Earps and Doc Holliday. But that doesn't mean there weren't consequences for their actions. Not only had they gained the reputation of cold-blooded killers, but the rest of the cowboys weren't going to take the deaths of their friends sitting down. The gang started plotting their revenge, and they would have it before long. Blood for blood. A few months after the gunfight at the Corral, Virgil Earp was suddenly ambushed on the streets of Tombstone. A shotgun blast struck him in the arm and shoulder, seriously maiming him. When Morgan Earp was playing billiards in a saloon, a group of gunmen shot him through the windows from the dark street outside. One of the bullets struck him in the spine, and he died 40 minutes later. That's when Wyatt Earp finally snapped. On the day his brother Morgan drew his last breath, Wyatt Earp left law and order behind. He lost all faith in civil justice and set about avenging his brother himself. He gathered together a posse of 8 men and swore that he would have his revenge on the Cochise County Cowboys. It was the start of the infamous Earp Vendetta Ride, which would claim the lives of several more men before it was finished. The Vendetta Ride, the Earps chased the remaining cowboys out into the wilderness. Ironically, one of the men they pursued was Curly Bill Brocious, the very man Wyatt had saved from a lynching little over a year earlier. When the Earps finally caught up with them, yet another gunfight ensued. Curly Bill himself fired directly at Wyatt but missed by a hair's breadth. Wyatt Earp, calm and cool as always, didn't even flinch. He returned fire, hitting Curly Bill in the chest from 50 feet away. After the gunfight that claimed the lives of Curly Bill and several other cowboys, the Earps were satisfied. But they had another problem on their hands. Remember, the Earp Vendetta Ride was completely outside the law, and you can't simply go around shooting people for vengeance, at least not without consequences. Johnny Behan had assembled his own crew, and he was hot on their trail. Behan's posse got within eyesight of the Earps but never managed to close the gap. Though the Earps had been prepared to stand and fight if necessary, Behan's men never actually caught them. The Earps gave them the slip and managed to sneak out of Arizona into New Mexico. Eventually, Behan was forced to give up, and Wyatt Earp got away with his grim justice, scot-free. The end of an era. The end of the Earp Vendetta Ride marked the end of an era in more ways than one. Not long after leaving Arizona, Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday had a falling out that led to the dissolution of their friendship. They parted ways and only saw each other twice for the rest of their lives. The final time they met, just 5 years later, Earp's wife Josephine noticed that Holliday was a shell of his former self. He was a hollow skeleton of a man who coughed constantly and could barely hold himself upright. Tuberculosis was claiming him. Josephine Earp, Johnny Behan and Wyatt Earp had at least one thing in common: they shared the same taste in women. When Behan arrived in Tombstone, he brought his wife with him, a woman named Sadie Mansfield. Most people, however, would come to know her by a different name, Josephine Earp. It turns out Sadie found Behan in bed with another woman soon after she arrived in Tombstone, so she kicked him out. Not long after, townfolk began to notice Sadie spending considerable time with Wyatt Earp. Everyone already knew he was Behan's biggest rival. If Earp couldn't have Behan's job, at least he could have Behan's woman. The final years. Following his adventures in the Wild West, Earp ended up in San Francisco with Sadie, who now went by Josephine Earp. They remained common law partners for over 4 decades until Earp's death. Wyatt Earp spent his final days in Los Angeles, working as an unpaid film consultant in Hollywood, trying desperately to get a movie about his life made. After a wild existence filled with gunfights and barroom brawls, he died quietly of peritonitis at 80 years old. He had outlived every single one of his siblings and left behind no children. By that time, he was one of the final relics of the Wild West, and the days of outlaws and gunslingers felt like a distant, fading memory. A legend carved in dust and gunpowder, forever etched into the American imagination.